Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Chapter 8, Social Movements. And our topic is Types of Social Movements, and subtopic is one way of classifying reformist, redemptive, revolutionary. There are different kinds of social movements. They can be classified as redemptive or transformatory, reformist, and revolutionary. A redemptive social movement aims to bring about a change in the personal consciousness and actions of its individual members. For instance, people in Ashava community in Kerala were led by Narayana Guru to change their social practices. Reformist social movements strive to change the existing social and political arrangements through gradual incremental steps. The 1960s movement for the reorganization of Indian states on the basis of language and the recent Right to Information campaign are examples of reformist movements. Revolutionary social movements attempt to radically transform social relations, often by capturing state power. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that deposed the Tsar to create a communist state, and the nationalist movement in India that seeks to remove oppressive landlords and state officials can be described as revolutionary movements. As you might discover when you try to classify a social movement in terms of this typology, most movements have a mix of redemptive, reformist, and revolutionary elements, or the orientation of a social movement may shift over time, such that it starts off with, say, revolutionary objectives and becomes reformist. A movement may start from a phase of mass mobilization and collective protest to become more institutionalized. Social scientists who study the life cycles of social movements call this a move towards social movement organizations. How a social movement is perceived and classified is always a matter of interpretation. It differs from one section to another. For instance, what was a mutiny or rebellion for British colonial rulers in 1857 was the first war of independence for Indian nationalists. A mutiny is an act of defense against legitimate authority, that is, the British rule. A struggle for independence is a challenge to British rule. This shows how people attach different meanings to social movements. Now let us discuss next point, another way of classifying old and new. For much of the 20th century, social movements were class-based, such as working class movement and peasant movements or anti-colonial movements. While anti-colonial movements united entire people into national liberation struggles, class-based movements united classes to fight for their rights. The most far-reaching social movements of the last century thus have been class-based or based on national liberation struggles. You have read in your history books about the workers' movement in Europe that gave rise to the international communist movement. Besides bringing about the formation of communist and socialist states across the world, most notably in the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, these movements also led to the reform of capitalism, the creation of welfare states that protected workers' rights and offered universal education, health care, and social security in the capitalist nations of Western Europe was partly due to political pressure created by the communist and socialist movements. The movements against colonialism has been as influential as the movement against capitalism. Since capitalism and colonialism have usually been interlinked through forms of imperialism, social movements have simultaneously targeted both these forms of exploitation. That is, nationalist movements have mobilized against rule by a foreign power as well as against the dominance of foreign capital. The decades after the Second World War witnessed the end of empire and the formation of new nation states as a result of nationalist movements in India, Egypt, Indonesia, and many other countries. Since then, another wave of social movements occurred in the 1960s and early 70s. This was the time of the war in Vietnam, where forces led by the United States of America were involved in a bloody conflict in the former French colony against communist guerrillas. In Europe, Paris was the nucleus of a vibrant students' movement that joined workers' parties in a series of strikes protesting against the war. Across the Atlantic, the United States of America was experiencing a surge of social protest. The civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King had been followed by the Black Power movement led by Malcolm X. The anti-war movement was joined by tens of thousands of students who were being compulsorily drafted by the government to go and fight in Vietnam. The women's movement and the environmental movement also gained strength during this time of social ferment. It was difficult to classify the members of these so-called new social movements as belonging to the same class or even nation, rather than a shared class identity. Participants felt that they shared identities as students, women, blacks, or environmentalists. However, the old social movements often based on class-related issues like the trade union or peasant movements different from the new social movements like the environmental or women or tribal movements. You are already familiar with the many instances of trade union movements and workers' struggles in chapter 5. Now let us move to the next point, distinguishing the new social movement from the old social movements. We have already seen that the historical context were different. That was a period when nationalist movements were overthrowing colonial powers, and working class movements in the capitalist West were wrestling better wages, better living conditions, social security, free schooling, and health security from the state. That was also a period when socialist movements were establishing new kinds of states and societies. The old social movements clearly saw reorganization of power relations as a central goal. The old social movements functioned within the frame of political parties. The Indian National Congress led the national movement. The Communist Party of China led the China Revolution. Today, some believe that old class-based political action led by the trade unions and workers' parties is on the decline. Others argued that in the affluent West, with its welfare state, issues of class-based exploitation and inequality were no longer central concerns. So the new social movements were not about changing the distribution of power in society, but about quality of life issues such as having a clean environment. In the old social movements, the role of political parties was central. Political scientist Rajni Kothari attributes the surge of social movements in India in the 1970s to people's growing dissatisfaction with parliamentary democracy. Kothari argues that the institutions of the states have been captured by elites. Due to this, electoral representation by political parties is no longer an effective way for the poor to get their voice heard. People left out by the formal political system join social movements or non-party political formations in order to put pressure on the state from outside. Today, the borders term of civil society is used to refer to both old social movements represented by political parties and trade unions, and to new non-governmental organizations, women's groups, environmental groups, and tribal activists. As you read about the various dimensions of social change in India, you would have been struck by the fact that the globalization has been reshaping people's lives in industry and agriculture, culture, and media. Often firms are transnational. Often legal arrangements that are binding are international, such as the regulations of the World Trade Organization. Environmental and health risks, fears of nuclear warfare are global in nature. Not surprisingly, therefore, many of the new social movements are international in scope. What is significant, however, is that the old and new movements are working together in new alliances, such as the World Social Forum, that have been raising awareness about the hazards of globalization. Now let us move to the next point. Can we apply the distinction between old and new social movements in the Indian context? India has experienced a whole array of social movements involving women, peasants, Dalit, Adivasis, and others. Can these movements be understood as new social movements? Gail Ombert, in her book Reinventing Revolution, points out that concerns about social inequality and the unequal distribution of resources continue to be important elements in these movements. Peasant movements have mobilized for better prices for their produce and protested against the removal of agricultural subsidies. Dalit laborers have acted collectively to ensure that they are not exploited by upper caste landowners and moneylenders. The women's movement have worked on issues of gender discrimination in diverse spheres like the workplace and within the family. At the same time, these new social movements are not just about old issues of economic inequality. Now are they organized along class lines alone? Identity politics, cultural anxieties, and aspirations are essential elements in creating social movements and occur in ways that are difficult to trace to class based inequality. Often, these social movements unite participants across class boundaries. For instance, the women's movement includes urban middle class feminists as well as poor peasant women. The regional movements for separate statehood bring together different groups of people who do not share homogeneous class identities. In a social movement, questions of social inequality can occur alongside other equally important issues. This will be clear when we discuss the Chipko movement later. Now, let us wind up the session and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning Podcast.